Highlands and Islands of Scotland, a land that arouses the passions of men. Some are besotted with the romanticism of its long and terrible history. Others see it as hard and hostile, a land to be fought over and plundered. Neither is good for the land or for the people who live here. Once upon a time, all who lived here owed allegiance to one lord, the Lord of the Isles, chieftain of Clan MacDonald, whose domain stretched from the Firth of Clyde to the northern tip of the Hebrides. But that's all a long, long time ago. Who has succeeded them? Who are the new lords of the Isles? Now owned by a man who writes songs about it.
Laird lies on a slick farm as a misty other day. Slipped the night from a shade bank, make a mock card lay. All twilight hours down from a heaven home, high above the highest bidder, for the good Lord's throne. In the wee hours I meet you, and down by the ring on we'll watch the old gods play. By the ring, by the ring.
The Strathaird estate, bought in 1974 by Mr. David Lewis, a London property developer. Price, £730,000. In the 2 years of ownership, he was seen on the estate for only a couple of hours before putting it on the market again. Ian McKinnon was the man who showed prospective buyers around. He was born on the estate, has worked all his life here, could see the potential, but he never had the means nor the security of tenure to develop his ideas. What did he feel about showing strangers over land that he has worked all his life?
Well, felt a bit bitter at times, certainly, about it. Really, what I felt was that I was the one that was really kept this estate going, really. Otherwise, the place would have really just completely fallen to wreck and ruin. But I had no option but to show them round.
And again, then, go.
This was the man who bought the estate in 1978, Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull, a group of fine musicians who have lasted for more than a decade of fickle fashion. The price he paid? £170,000, which means that his predecessor, David Lewis, lost more than £500,000. What went through Ian McKinnon's mind when he knew that a pop musician was to be his new laird?
Well, which is a haven of drugs here, and that sort of thing. That was the first thing I thought, and I thought, you know, this is it. This is the end of the estate as far as I'm concerned. And the following week, Ian Anderson turned up, and as soon as I saw him, I knew he was Jethro Tull. I mean, he didn't have to tell me, even though I hadn't seen him before. And that was the beginning of the Ian Anderson side of the estate.
They must have looked on you with suspicion.
I'm sure they did, and it would be very foolish if they did not still look upon me with suspicion, because only time will tell whether I prove ultimately to be a good laird or one of the bad lairds that we so often hear about still. And they should quite rightly view me with great suspicion, and probably my son after me. You know, it'll take a few generations perhaps before, you know, we see whether it was a good idea.
And what's it like now under Ian Anderson?
Well, it's a lot better, really. Things have changed vastly, really, for the simple reason that he's one of the few landlords that seems to be prepared to invest a substantial amount of his money into the land, which really is a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Good for, basically for me and for the island as a whole, I would say.
Stumbling upon, as we did the first time when we went to Kilmarie, a place which was so obviously derelict and yet still so obviously alive, or just waiting for someone to snap a magic, not a finger, but a building trowel and a paintbrush or something to make it come alive again. It's a great feeling, and it's that sort of image that I have when I'm away. I can't wait to get back just to carry on with some little, however small, act of rebuilding that feeling of life.
Well, actually, when Ian Anderson bought the estate first, we decided that we'd better draw up a plan of what I would like seen done on the farm. With the help of the North of Scotland College of Agriculture, and we're on this 5-year scheme now. Well, it really involves increasing the stock from 1,000 breeding ewes at the moment to 1,600, but hopefully we would be more than that. We'd be up to about the 2,000 mark, with a herd of between 20 and 60 purebred Highland cows. They don't require as much feeding as the other breeds do, and living in a place like Skye, the cost of feeding is so much higher than on the mainland. And for this reason, we'd rather take the Highland cow, which might be a bit slower in maturing, but at the same time gives you a good carcass at the end of the day and has cost you less. I think there is a future for fish farming for the simple reason that we seem to be running out of fish stocks in the sea. So obviously, I mean, we've got to look to some other way of producing fish. We put in a test station last August, and we did tests throughout the winter to see just what the waters were like, the temperatures, currents, fouling, so on, oxygen levels were like. And they proved quite successful, and we got our first lot of smolts in late June.
Ironically, where we have our fish farm started was in fact the site of the herring industry on that part of the island. Exactly that same point was one of the old crofters told me his grandfather could remember the herring boats where you could walk across Loch Slapin just by stepping from the deck of one boat to another. There were so many, and of course there's nothing there now except a fish farm with some salmon in it. But maybe 10 years' time you'll be able to walk across Slapin again on on salmon cages. So I mean, I have my models to emulate, and I'm doing it with the best of modern methods, but still with an eye to tradition, which I believe is a very important thing.
I should think in 5 or 6 years' time, I would hope that the estate would be quite a viable proposition by then.
And how much money will he have to put in that time? What are we talking about? Hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands?
Oh, hundreds of thousands.
So 5 or 10 years of pumping money into
I've got to go out to work. You see, I am not the epitome in terms of days of old, but in terms of today's realities, I am the absentee landlord. I mean, the only way that Strathaird can develop is for me to go out and not live in England, but I mean to travel the world to earn the money, to put things right. And I make no apologies for being an absentee landlord. It is the only possible way for the estate, or at least under my ownership, in inverted commas. I think I can safely say that when I play a concert in Boston, my share of the money from that concert, I'm sure the kids who pay their $10 a ticket or whatever would rather see me doing something with the money which, if they care to visit, is for them as well, because they can come and walk the hills or walk down the road just as I can. There is more benefit to be derived, perhaps, than me spending the money on a Rolls Royce or building an Olympic swimming pool in my back garden or something, which would be a real bother. I mean, I can't see me polishing the Rolls Royce or cleaning it every Sunday morning. Whereas the hills of Strathaird, the good Lord cleans those for me every Sunday morning. Pours with rain.
We'll wait in stone circles until the force comes through. song watched the roost. A concert of kings as the white sea snaps, 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 snaps. At the heels of a soft red whispered. In the wee hours I need you, down by Dunring Hill. Oh, now take you quickly. Oh, by Dunring Hill. By Dunring Hill. By Dunring Hill.
Villains in this are not just the potential bad landlords who come in with this idea of owning something, of, you know, abusing it perhaps, but the people who allow them to do so, by which I mean estate agents primarily, solicitors, you know, secondarily, and accountants and offshore companies who front these individuals. I mean, those are the real traitors. They're very often Scottish firms, and I mean, there should be some sort of restriction placed upon on buying, whether it's foreign or you know, or whatever. I think every landlord who wants to be a landlord should be sent into a room, you know, with 10 pages of foolscap paper and made to write an essay on why he wants to buy this piece of land, you know, and locked away in there until he's come out with it.
In Food and Drink this week, the rock star who farms his own salmon. When putting on makeup is the most natural thing in the world. And it's Britain's fastest growing drink. But what's cider and what's not?
When you are thinking of eating and drinking, take out or dining in style. Ice cream and pizza, bangers and mash, champagne and caviar. Eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we diet. Don't be discreet, give yourself a treat and tuck into food and drink.
Seem to spend their newfound wealth on Victorian Gothic villas in Surrey or mansions in Beverly Hills. But not Ian Anderson, lead singer and flautist extraordinary with Jethro Tull. He's found a different way of using his money and has returned to his native Scotland to create a thriving enterprise on his own estate on the Isle of Skye.
Well, my coming here really stems from, I suppose, as far back as 1973-ish, when I suddenly found I was making a modest amount of money and thought that there ought to be better things to do with it than what other people would consider to be the appropriate trappings of such success. And I started back then looking for an estate in Scotland. I mean, anything from 10 acres to thousands. I used to go on tour, you see, sitting on transatlantic flights surrounded by books on fish farming and reading dressing rooms and things, trying to pick up what it was all about. And we began the testing here in '78. Having bought the estate, first thing we did, in fact, was to put a raft out there and test for oxygen, temperature, currents, and so on. We did that for 9 months and put our first cage in the water, which appeared to do everything that the books suggested they might.
Ian Anderson's aim was to buy a property which would give him some return on his investment. The biggest asset of this 15,000-acre estate is its sheltered loch, and it seemed the ideal location for a salmon farm. 6 years after his first experiments, he is now producing about 100 tons of salmon a year. Although expensive to set up, the running costs on the farm are kept down with a high degree of automation. Each feeder holds a day's supply of food, which it drops into the salmon cages at 1-minute intervals. Every cage holds about 2,000 fish, which are graded by age and size, and they need 2 years on the farm before they are ready to be eaten. But of course there are casualties along the way. The 20 cages have to be checked for dead fish every day, and then the corpses are examined for any disease. In charge of this operation is Robert Kelly, who used to be the Jethro Tull Road manager. He is now the manager of the salmon farm.
No, can't see anything wrong with that.
All right, put it down to suicide. It really does take the pressure off the wild species, and I think most people are aware that wild salmon are diminishing in numbers, or at least are being caught in less numbers. They have certainly been overfished for a great many years now. And the last 2 or 3 years have certainly seen a decline in catches and an increase effectively in the price, which has ironically made it possible to farm salmon in the first place. If the wild were more plentiful, the price would be lower, simple supply and demand, and it would not be economic to farm the species.
No, leave that in there.
A good wild fish is terrific, but an average wild salmon being netted at sea tend to be badly handled on occasion. You can never really be sure how fresh the fish is if it's been in and out of boats, in and out of freeze, guts probably been left in it too long and so on. But a lot of people will actually go for farmed over wild because of consistency of quality.
Surprisingly, salmon farming does not lower the price of this already expensive fish. Whereas the cost of farmed trout is about 1/3 of wild, farmed and wild salmon keep pace with each other. But with more than 60 salmon farms already operating in Scotland, the price might start to fall. Traditionally, salmon was only available during the summer months, when the wild fish swam in from the sea and up into the freshwater rivers to spawn. But now there's a continuous production, with the fish being harvested all the year round. So that the much valued pink flesh does not get bruised, salmon must not be moved for 12 hours after rigor mortis has set in. Over on the other side of Scotland, near Inverness, is the smoking factory which Ian Anderson set up with some financial help from the Highlands and Islands Development Board. It mainly processes the salmon from his own farm, but occasionally it takes in other people's salmon, or even venison. Most of the fish grown on the farm go for smoking, although some are sold fresh, either in British fish markets or, increasingly, for export to France and Belgium. Smoking is a complicated business, what with the gutting, the deboning, the soaking, and the salting to bring out the flavour. Then each fish needs 7 hours, absorbing the smoke made by burning oak wood shavings. But considering the returns, it's all worthwhile. An average salmon costs about £1.20 to raise,
but smoked salmon can fetch more than £10 a pound, with most smoked salmons weighing in at about £5 each.
Well, I think salmon is always going to be, relatively speaking, at the luxury end of the food spectrum, but I think these days people take their eating more seriously, and smoked salmon is one of those available items at a reasonable price, although it is obviously a luxury. Salmon being a fairly low-fat, high-protein, good-quality fish is ideal, I think, alternative to the Sunday roast or any quality meat. I'm a serious farmer of salmon. I muck in from time to time, you know, and I quite enjoy doing the work. But up till now, certainly, it's been down to me to provide the financing for it, which I can more easily do in the pursuit for which I'm better known. Salmon farming is the tip of the iceberg as far as aquaculture is concerned in the western part of Scotland. And probably within 5 years, we'll find farming halibut, turbot and cod real possibilities economically, because it costs money to raise an animal, whether it's a cow, a salmon or whatever it might be.
A poacher and his daughter throw soft shadows on the water in the night. Behind them as they pull the net with no betraying light. Later on the coast road, I meet them and the old man wins a smile. And who am I to pass deny the right to take a fish for once in a while?
The Isle of Skye off Scotland's west coast, one of the most romantic places anywhere in the world. And it's here on the 15,000-acre Strathaird estate that a familiar face from the world of rock music has become established as the new owner.
I would like to think that one way or another I probably would have come back to a corner of Scotland, being Scottish by birth, whatever had been my career. In the 15 months since I did my last sort of major tour, I've just devoted myself really to being up here for 2 or 3 days every week, commuting up from England or commuting down to England, depending on which way you look at it.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Ian Anderson has achieved international recognition with the rock group Jethro Tull, and since taking over the estate 10 years ago, he's established one of the most successful fish farming businesses in the area. From the time he started the fish farm as a part of the business of the estate 8 years ago, he's personally overseen the running of the operation. It's a commitment based on his love of the place.
Strathaird Estate is basically a peninsula of something like 15,300 acres or thereabouts, which takes in on its northern boundaries a fair chunk of the Black Coolins. These days, I should think half of the residents of Strathaird Estate in the summer are actually holiday home owners. I suppose there are something like 50-odd crofts here. There's nothing like the permanent crofting community that there was, and indeed a lot of them no longer really actively, individually work their crofts. The estate farm is really only about 350 acres of sort of in-byland and hill grazing over another few thousand acres. 6,000 acres of it are probably pretty vertical. Once upon a time in an aeroplane, I read in one of these dreadful in-flight magazines that are full of nothing, something about farming salmon somewhere. And that must have caught my overtired imagination on the way back from America or something, and just sounded like an interesting and slightly revolutionary thing to do. I've always been keen on farming notionally anyway, even in the traditional agricultural sense, but the idea of alternative farming, farming something a bit more romantic and a bit more risky, sort of caught on. So when this estate came on the market, I managed to make a successful bid for it, basically predicated on the fact that there was a suitable or an apparently suitable sea loch, which looked like it would be a workable environment for rearing salmon. The thing about buying an estate like this, it's all very well if you happen to be in a period of your life where you're relatively high earning, to say, I can afford to rush out and buy this and maybe even spend a few bob to, you know, tart the place up and make it look nice. But as a responsible landowner, you've got to think a little bit beyond that, and maybe even a generation or two beyond that, and say, well, can we afford to keep this? Is it going to be a millstone around our necks within 5 years' time? Or it's important for me going into this to have some idea of getting income, of making the estate, if not profitable, at least reducing the loss.
When he took on the estate, an early priority was to find someone to run the hill farm. Ian McKinnon, born and bred on the island, had managed Strathaird for the previous owner. On an island where outsiders are not guaranteed acceptance by the locals, this was a shrewd move. Ian McKinnon, with his local knowledge of the estate, was to prove invaluable in helping Ian Anderson to make the transition.
I was warned by the late Willie McRae of the Scottish Nationalist Party that, you know, it was a big mistake coming up here or buying Strathaird. It was a big mistake to be involved in any way with the sort of complexities of the social scene up here, that I would not be respected, I would not be liked, you know, and all the rest of it. I argued with Willie McRae about this and said, well, I just don't believe that people are that simple-minded.
Where are these off to?
Well, most of them possibly are going down to eastern counties in England. As we're selecting lambs there today for a special market, well, everybody's looking now for this lamb with a bit of length to it, a bit of scope to it, to grow on, get more weight on without becoming fat.
Mm-hmm. And we've got no problems in moving these, no restrictions, no nuclear lambs here.
No, we don't. We have had tests done by the ministry and readings were very low. We've had some lambs even off the farm here itself, and they were giving us readings of about 180 spectrals per kilo, right. Which is, you know, very low.
Which is very low considering the high rainfall we have.
Right.
I think if anyone was going to get clobbered, we would. But
would have thought so, but
they're not glowing in the dark.
Fortunately, they're not. No.
The commitment to the hill farm as part of the commitment to the estate as a whole has to be continued resolutely through thick and thin. We obviously face in hill farming an obvious downtrend at the moment in terms of the possibility of even breaking even, which we just about managed to do. So how did the bull perform then?
Well, the bull's done quite well, actually. It's only being a 14-month-old bull, you know, one's got to be kind of easy on him, but he's done his job very well indeed. And hopefully we should get a good crop of calves off him next year.
Yeah. We have certain restrictions placed upon us here in farming terms by the weather, by the type of land we have, which is relatively very poor grazing, even our best grazing. You put caravans on it in the south of England.
Really, you know, if it's damp at all, and there are rushes there that seem to come back, you know, they're just...
It's the harsh reality up here that there's very little you can do on the land. There's not much room for the flexibility that you need in order to keep pace with the changing demands of the market. The shelter belts up here, I mean, these are obviously going to be uneconomic to plant up again in that sort of configuration. I mean, for a start, they're going to have to be clear felled at some point to make it viable to take them out at all.
There'll be something going for getting trees in there on the far side of that plantation at the moment. Something that, you know, would have a couple of years up before you clear fell what's there. At least it would give you a start on you know, new shelter.
Well, whatever happens, we're going to have to wait and see what the next round of grants are going to be like before we can make up our minds where to move.
That's right.
The record of absentee landlords in the Highlands is not a happy one, and it's a situation that has caused problems for the estate in the past. While Ian Anderson may have a more enlightened view than many others, there are still those who monitor incomers with critical interest.
On the credit side, Ian Anderson is here he's doing something. There is some economic activity, there's some employment, and that is a lot more that can be said for many more of these people. On this estate, for instance, the previous one, the fellow that Anderson bought it from, was a man called David Lewis, who was a straightforward property speculator based in London, who bought it speculatively and thought he could sell it speculatively, and in the interim did nothing. So you have 15,000 acres of this country which lay derelict for the duration of his stewardship.
Brian Wilson's got nothing on me when it comes to, running around and pointing the finger at some, scum of the earth who are still, landed gentry around Scotland. It really annoys me to see run down. I mean, they refuse to give up. They refuse to quit and call it a day. That's what really gets my goat.
Rural communities should not be subject to that lottery, that every time an estate changes hands, the lottery begins again of whether it's going to be just yet another useless parasitical figure, or whether it's going to be someone who perhaps in the short term, perhaps for amusement, perhaps for serious and decent purposes, is prepared to invest in it.
The last few years I've been doing part-time on the estate, gathering and dipping and all that, bits of fencing. A lot of them thoroughly won't know him yet. They just know of him as Ian Anderson. Probably a lot of them haven't met him. There'll be quite a few that haven't. Most of the younger ones, I suppose.
What about the older folks in Elgort?
I don't think they'll ever have met him. They wouldn't. I don't suppose they would be interested anyway. Landlord would be a landlord to them. Nothing, just no matter who it was just all one to them.
It's pointless getting really self-conscious about this thing about being the laird and the crofters being your tenants who pay your rent and all that. I mean, it's no big deal. But I mean, I'm sure it's no big deal to them either. I mean, it really isn't. We tripled the rents a few years ago. For the first time, the rents went up from an average of about £4 a year per croft. We put them up to an average of about £12 per year per croft, because we decided that rather than not collect the rents, that we would make available from the estate every year a sum of money equal to the rents that we'd collected to be used on something for the good of crofting. And somebody else might say, well, you could afford to give them $20,000 a year or build a new village hall or whatever else. They wouldn't respect me for that.
Away from the bustle of touring with a rock band, Ian Anderson lives a life of sharp contrast among some of the most spectacular scenery that Scotland can provide. It's clear that his experience of running one successful venture has helped another take off. There are a few ripples on the water, however. In an area where jobs are scarce enough, there's some concern that the fish farm, which could have been a considerable source of employment for local people, has not turned into the jobs bonanza that it might have been.
Well, it's tremendously difficult for the islanders here to make what I think should be the full potential, because it's a capital-intensive industry. So if the grant structure and the loan structure is not geared to the local economy, then inevitably what is going to happen is that money is going to control the industry, and that means outside money. And that, by and large, what has happened. It's interesting to see the contrast between Skye, where fish farming is almost exclusively in the hands of outside capital, and the Western Isles, where there was a development programme which allowed for a much higher grant level. And there you had many local people coming into the industry as the developers, rather than simply as the waged employees.
Right, Robert, we've got a couple of...
Robert Kelly was one-time road manager with Jethro Tull. He's since come to work on the island as fish farm manager. Together, he and Ian Anderson take policy and staff decisions.
I could have a word with her, see what she's looking for and see if she's suitable.
That's right. I mean, again, it depends. I mean, presumably she's looking for something full-time. You can explain to her sort of what the potential might be. This one is he's 34, is he, from Achnacarry?
Yeah, he's got a degree in agriculture.
That's right. And he's got no background at all in fish farming, but I spoke to him on the phone yesterday. As he puts it, he's only 100 yards up the road. He's actually the 4th house down in the Crofting Township, so he's probably only a couple of 100 yards actually away from the site.
The sites themselves have become a bone of contention with the Crown Estate Commissioners, the body which owns the seabed and which is responsible for where and if fish farming sites can be located.
It seems to me incredible that in 1986 in this country that the myth exists that the seabed belongs to the Crown and that therefore the control of an industry as important as this resides with totally faceless people, various lords and earls called the Crown Estate Commissioners, and it was in their hands to dispense the rights to the seabed. And in these early days, the deals were done between the multinationals and the Crown Estate Commissioners without the local communities having any idea of what was going on. And then, too late in the day, they realised that people living beside lochs which had this tremendous value potential for fish farming realised that the leases had been bought up and something was going on below their noses. So once again, it's not that if you live in remote communities in Scotland, you're not the ones who know what is going on in the Crown Estate Commissioner's office in Charlotte Square. You're not the ones who know what deals are being cooked in the boardroom of Unilever. What you know is when something starts happening on the ground and you realise that another potential development asset has been conceded.
The risks are fairly high. I mean, I think you've got to accept that one way or another you probably budget for something like between 15 and 20% mortality per annum on your sea stock for one reason or another. Now, logically speaking, there's no reason why you should lose more than 3 or 4% off them at sea, but something happens every year. There is always something that comes and knocks you sideways. But again, it's reducing that level of risk to an acceptable ongoing level that is part of staying in the business.
Sales of smoked salmon are on the increase, with the Scottish variety leading the market. The North Atlantic salmon is a regal fish bred for size and quality. After a year spent in growing tanks, they're transferred to the sea cages. Here, fed on a diet of concentrated food pellets, they will spend the next 2 years growing to a killing weight of 5 or 6 kilos.
In order to have the ideal genetic pool for the future, we have, during this last year, taken a lot of purebred wild fish from the two of Scotland's good rivers, the Spey and the Conan. I personally like the idea that we try and retain some of that mystique of the wild Scottish North Atlantic salmon, that we always have that animal in its pure, unadulterated form available to back cross with our selected best multi-generation farmed stock. It probably isn't necessary, but I think it's nonetheless prudent to have that availability.
Difficulty in obtaining top-quality eggs has led to the establishment of their own brood stock. Now the fish are regularly graded for their breeding potential. This development will help to ensure a strong, disease-free strain, and with the addition of the occasional stock from the wild, the cycle from egg to fully grown fish will be complete.
Aye, that's fine.
Dig that.
The mature females are taken for examination. Here the eggs are counted and checked for quality before being transferred to the hatcheries.
They're quite good mixes, aren't they?
They're not bad, actually. Yeah, here's a female. They're fairly developed, aren't they? They've still got... Yeah, it looks to be in good condition to me.
Yeah, it's all a good colour.
Yeah.
Right, well, I'm hoping to hear something from the HIDB next week about whether they're going to approve this emergency grant for our extra dam buttressing work. So hopefully we'll be in a position to decide fairly soon what time scale for that.
The hatchery has benefited from having a stream that guarantees a supply of clean water all year round. Stored in a dam near the site, this ensures that the fry get a healthy start in life. It's part of the plan to safeguard the future of the farm. Ian Anderson has taken the central role, from helping design the tanks in the hatchery to picking the sites for more sea cages at the northerly store locks or the newly completed growing tanks at Skibost. These new developments have been undertaken with a view to increasing yearly production to 200 tonnes. At Skibost, the finishing touches are being made to the tanks that will house the smolts before they're moved to the sea cages. Wherever possible, these new sites have been kept out of the way in an attempt to preserve the natural beauty of the surroundings.
However charitable you might be about salmon pens, cages and the water, they are a bit of an eyesore. Being rather geometrical shapes in the water, they don't look that pretty. So I mean, that's the way they affect most people in the most direct ways, is the fact that it's a visual sort of impinging on a view that they've taken for granted for years and years and years. Personally speaking, I don't find them that much of an eyesore in relation to perhaps the option of seeing, you know, red and yellow sailed pleasure boats or whatever occupying the same bit of water, or perhaps people fishing in the conventional sense, prawn creels or whatever else. The fact of life is people out there on the water earning their living day to day.
When the fish have reached full size, they're killed and frozen for the journey to Ian Anderson's smoking and packing plant at Inverness.
We have considered processing salmon on Skye, but I think given the expansion that we're undertaking in salmon farming, we need something a bit more central and something a bit better able to deal with the tonnage throughput that we would have 2 or 3 years down the line. But we chose to have an all-Scottish sort of setup. So Inverness was the choice back in 1982, and I think it was the right choice. If it wasn't Inverness, it could only have been in London. Smoked salmon is a very, very competitive business. We can't supply a single hotel or a single little restaurant or delicatessen in London the way the London smokers can, so we tend to deal more in bulk. So we supply people like Harrods and Selfridges, and probably we will continue to base most of our sales on the export trade. That's really the biggest growth area, particularly in the US, where they don't really know yet what smoked salmon is. We actually do have the right environment for growing North Atlantic salmon, and we can actually grow better than it seems anybody else in the world can do it. So Scottish salmon really is a very exciting thing to be involved in. The ones who are good at it will continue to do okay, and the ones who aren't will fall by the wayside.
Falling by the wayside is not a fate likely to threaten Ian Anderson. As founder of a successful musical enterprise, he's put his business experience to good use on Skye. His deep involvement here should guarantee the survival of his Hebridean venture.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Anderson. Ian, it's 20 years, and in all that 20 years, have you ever come to actually like show business?
Well, I don't think luckily, I haven't spent 20 years in show business. I've been fortunate enough to spend 20 years playing music in a different kind of a context. So I've never really been anything other than very much in the periphery of the show-busy end of rock and roll or pop music. So I don't have a lot to do with it. I stand very much as an outsider and sort of, you know, smile behind my hand at some of the more poppy groups who come and go over the years, and we just carry on doing whatever it is we do. And I've no idea what it is or why people still like it. But,
so you don't have, like, gold records at home and stage costumes hanging up like, say, Elton John might have, something like that?
Nope. Nothing like that. No, I don't keep photographs, gold albums, or anything around the house because, I mean, if you do it for a living, or in my case, at least for half the time, I'm still playing, making records and doing concert tours, and it's great to have it as fun and exciting and coming back to it when you go out and do a 3-month tour again. And to be reminded in your day-to-day environment of what you do is not, you know, I think it detracts from the sort of the coming and going from that kind of life, being a rock and roller on the road and doing the stuff that I do back here, which is, as you've pointed out, more in the fish farming context.
Which we'll talk about in just a moment, but staying with music for the second. Looking at photographs through 20 years' history of Jethro Tull, it struck me that you have always looked like a kind of student hippie who's pinched his dad's coat and his mum's wooden beads. You've never changed, really, have you?
Well, where are the wooden beads? I mean, goodness me, I loathe hippies. I mean, I didn't actually... We came up at a time that was a bit post-hippie. I mean, the dying sort of embers of the hippie era. And I personally just sort of loathe the hippie thing and all that it stood for. I mean, I've never even tried smoking marijuana yet, let alone any of the other stuff. So, I mean, I wasn't part of that drug and social culture that people associate with the hippies. I came a bit after that, you know. Not long after it, but, you know, definitely at the tail end. So, I mean, I never had anything to do with it, and it's... to be thought of as being some sort of aging hippie dinosaur rock band is an easy peg, you know, to hang Jethro Tull on, but it's not really quite the case. I think we've been a bit more serious musically than perhaps that.
But in this business, of course, image is important. What did Americans think of you all coming over there with the long hair, the beards, the caftans, that sort of thing?
I think they saw us as being terribly British, and in some ways perhaps we were relative to the sort of American clones that Britain was turning out at the time, you know, particularly in the R&B field, which was very Americanized sort of R&B, whereas we did something that was, although it had a blues base, it was still something a bit more eclectic and a bit more sort of British or European in flavour. I mean, there were elements of Celtic folk music and classical music.
It wasn't just rhythm and blues that you were doing, of course.
Only maybe in the first 6 or 8 months, you know, when we were trying to, you know, get arrested in the London clubs. You know.
Before you did the rhythm and blues, I mean, way back before Jethro Tull was formed, 1963, you were called the Blades. What sort of music were you doing, and just how awful were you then in your first inception as a group?
Well, we were indeed so awful that we changed our name in those early days every week. Our agent in the office used to have to think of a different name for the group every week in order to try and get a return booking at the clubs, because no one wanted us back, you know. So every week we'd be somebody different, and we never knew, because he never told us what we were called that week. And we'd arrive in front of some famous London club and look down the billboard outside, and whichever group we'd never heard of before, we figured that must be us, and we'd go and introduce ourselves. Some poor club manager would say, "Wait a minute, you know, haven't I seen you before?" And I said, "No, we've never." "Oh, you don't mean my brother, do you? And that dreadful, you didn't book them, did you? They're awful." And eventually we got a residency at the Marquee Club when we'd sort of come of musical age, as it were, and then we had to stick with the name we had that week, which was indeed Jethro Tull.
You touched earlier on this fish farming in Skye. How much at home are you with it? I mean, I read of you periodically in the papers when somebody's up in arms about what you're doing up there for various reasons.
Not usually so much about what I'm doing. I'm not attacked nearly as much as other entities, or indeed the industry as a whole. I've got off fairly lightly, but we do have 7 operating sites now and a couple of factory premises in Inverness, and about 100 people being employed overall. And my little part of the fish farming industry is a meaningful part of what is a very meaningful whole. I mean, there's over 1,000 people directly employed in fish farming. It has brought permanent employment to many local people in areas where there were just no job prospects. I mean, let alone career prospects. And I'd like to think of fish farming as not just being a job. It's not just throwing feed at fish, but it's something that's a career opportunity. And we're all for having kids from the local schools go off and finish their education, get degrees at Stirling University, wherever they can, and come back to work, not just a job, but as a long-term career. Fish farming has got to be here to stay. It's got to learn, as indeed it is learning, to sit within the rules of conservation, ecology, and so on.
Are you going to stay committed to it?
I have to do. I mean, I've got a lot of personal involvement in it, as well as a great emotional involvement.
Well, Ian, for the moment, thank you, and who knows, here's to the next 20 years of music. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Anderson.
After lunch, George Rafferty and Shona and Ian Anderson will be judging the floats in the pageant.
The family are all organised. Shona, I think I'll just go right round the table.
Super.
Shona and Ian and the 2 children.
Yes, Glenn and James.
Hi. Hello. This is John, number 1 in the family. Hello, John. Jean, number 2 in the family. Trina, granddaughter. Hello. Another wee granddaughter. Oh, she's not going to speak to you. She's shy. Anne, a daughter. And the most important one in the whole business, my wife, Jill. Now, have a seat and we'll have some.
Don't think we'll need too much because it's
Right. You take that to your mum?
Yeah. Yep. Trina's getting her own suit.
This is the final call for the pet parade, to be judged this afternoon by Mrs. Rafferty and her daughter Jean.
Yeah, that then the sheep and then the bearded, you think? And then the wee King Charles.
In the main round at the moment, the pageant is being judged by George Rafferty and Shona and Ian Anderson.
There we are.
No. Could you give me your name, your first prize? Iona. Iona Lee.
At the moment, Mrs. Rafferty is judging the pet parade.
Very good.
We have to congratulate the youngsters on an excellent display. Second is number 7.
Congratulations. Thank you very much. Thank you, Assistant. You're holding up a good veterinary tradition, having a dram.
Welcome back. A major new investment in Highland fish farming was announced today with the opening of a £200,000 fish processing factory. The Inverness processing unit is a major vote of confidence in an industry currently fighting sharply falling prices. It greatly increases former Jethro Tull rock star Ian Anderson's stake in fish farming. It's expected to net him £1 million a month. And in an economic climate which has put many farmers to the wall, he's predicting future growth. Isabel Fraser reports.
The new processing plant, opened today by Highlands and Islands Euro MP Winnie Ewing, is the latest addition to Ian Anderson's salmon investments, bringing the total financing for facilities in Inverness to £300,000 this year. Overall, the Ian Anderson Group's £2.5 million cash commitment to the industry is amongst the most significant in the north, the fish farming and production sectors employing 170 people. Sales of their Strathaird salmon have doubled over the past 3 years, and despite the present problems of falling prices, which have forced many smaller producers out of business, Strathaird are confident.
The industry is here, and hopefully the industry is here to stay. I mean, there have been problems, as were inevitable with a new industry that was production-oriented, I mean, production-led in terms of its expansion. But I think the industry, if we talk about aquaculture in its global sense in the UK, I mean, it's definitely here to stay. Salmon farming obviously still represents the greatest part of that aquacultural industry, but here at Strathaird, we may be poised to embrace other aspects of aquaculture as they become productive in terms of harvestable products. Other fin fish, shellfish, for example, I'm particularly keen to look at the shellfish processing side of things, perhaps not at this building, but in due course elsewhere.
The new plant will double Strathaird's fish handling capacity to 10 tonnes a day, with 100 staff working at peak processing times. Management say the investment will markedly increase overall efficiency.
We did a big £500,000 expansion last year, particularly based around the smoke side. And we've now found that we needed to expand our facilities for gutting the fresh fish. And it was advantageous to build a separate building with separate drainage and keep, shall we say, the messy part of the business totally separated from the high-value part. It also means that we can take fish in from other people's farms, and either when they come through this building, they can either go straight onto a lorry and off to a market or off to other processors, or equally they can then go across into our main factory for turning into smoked salmon.
Looking to the future, the industry can expect two major problems to keep resurfacing: clashes with the conservation lobby and Norwegian exports. In the European Parliament, Winnie Ewing will soon present new evidence to support her claims of unfair practices by the Norwegians involving the dumping of huge amounts of salmon on the international market. On the conservation front, Ian Anderson sees a steady and sensible growth will provide a workable solution.
Looking at the global picture, it's an industry we want to have go on in the long term. Therefore, it's the ideal type of industry to be gradually, in a planned sense, introducing new jobs here at Strathaird and amongst our other competitors in Scotland. They're increasing the size of their production units sensibly and carefully. I mean, I think we've got past the stage where it was jobs for everybody, you know, and the danger that it might all suddenly cave in. I don't think that'll happen here.
Ian Anderson.
When furunculosis, a much more serious disease, strikes on a fish farm, the salmon have to be treated with antibiotics in their food. It's a disease and a treatment which greatly troubles fish farmers like Ian Anderson.
Have you lost a lot of fish from furunculosis in particular and from disease?
Yes, furunculosis has probably been the major problem, very often exacerbated by sea lice problems. I think most of us be a very lucky Scottish salmon farmer who's not lost at one time or another substantial quantities of stock to furunculosis. More often than not, it reaches epidemic proportion. You could lose 40%, 50%, 80% of your stock if you don't treat. And antibiotics are the means whereby we have to treat. But we are only licensed to use 4 antibiotics. And there's always the problem of disease resistance building up. By and large, it has been the practice in the past not to treat prophylactically, i.e. if the animal does not show clinical signs of disease, if they're not dying in front of your eyes, don't treat them with antibiotics. That's been a view that I for one, tended to hold for a number of years. I've now come to the conclusion that under certain circumstances, the prophylactic treatment is advisable, if only for the fact that then one can minimize, usually because you're then treating fish before they have become ill, usually when they are smaller, that there may be sound grounds for treating fish perhaps just before they go to sea or just after they've gone to sea, using relatively small amounts of antibiotic, giving, if you like, fish that get a good start in the marine environment and then do not require further treatment with necessarily large amounts of antibiotic because you treat relative to the body weight of the fish.
To achieve the required colour, a pigment called astaxanthin is added to the pellets fed to the fish.
Part of the constituent part of salmon is a healthy dose of astaxanthin in the flesh that you eat, and it's not there by accident. It's nature's way of providing an important pigment which it would appear has a very profound effect on the viability of salmon ova. It is a pigment that nature has put there for a purpose, and one which, apart from appearance's sake, one we feel we should observe. We're as closely as possible replicating what nature does in the wild. So any talk of artificial dyes and all the rest of it is emotive and really unnecessary language.
The next test is to measure the fish's fat content.
We look towards a level of fat, around about 8 to 12% level of fat in the products. Not all of the fish that we produce is going to fall within that range, but at least we produce an analysis for the customer to let him see before he takes the fish, which may say that 80% of his fish are going to fall within the level of specification that he's asking for. 20% may not, and it's up to him then whether he takes the product or not. We certainly, as time goes on, do our best to fulfill the customer's requirements, but we're a long way off being able to define the product totally.
Though pigment to colour the fish and drugs to treat its ills are added to salmon food, the main constituent of fish food is fish. It takes 5 tons of other species of fish to make the food, to feed the salmon, to produce 1 ton of marketable product.
We're taking low-valued industrial, so-called industrial species of fish, capelin, pollock, whatever they might be. Sand eels you've probably heard mentioned as well, being a possible constituent of salmon feed. But basically oily fish, by and large, that salmon would consume in the wild, but taking them, those low-value fish, and then converting them into something high-value, i.e. the salmon. And that's not the kind of thing that we should be doing more than a bit of. I mean, I have enjoyed being a salmon farmer, enjoy being part of that, but what would interest me a great deal more is the idea of the management of the global fish farm. At the moment we're in the throes of trying to industrialize a process which I don't think you can industrialize beyond a certain level. Growing salmon, any livestock for that matter, is a hands-on, green-fingered type of approach. It does not lend itself readily to the degree of industrialization which we're already applying to it.
For fish farming, an industry once hailed as a dream come true, the future looks gloomy. A combination of falling prices, disease and parasites, together with dwindling stocks of industrial fish for feed, have conspired to turn the dream sour. As yet, nobody knows the real price to be paid for domesticating the king of fish, the wild Atlantic salmon.
The farmers believe thousands of British jobs are at risk. In the Highlands and Islands, where fish farming is a main source of employment, locals are calling on the government to intervene.
Salmon farming has been a lifeline for the remote communities of the Scottish Highlands and Islands, providing 6,000 jobs and nearly £200 million a year for local economies. But after the boom of the 80s, the industry is on the brink of disaster. A glut of Norwegian salmon has led to a collapse in prices, leaving many Scottish farmers facing ruin.
If there is no improvement, I'm afraid that we won't be placing smolts next year.
You'll just pull out of salmon farming?
We'll give up once we've harvested out the fish that we have in the water.
Despite a minimum import price set by the European Union, Scottish salmon's fetching little more than £1 a pound, and farmers are losing £1 million a week. They accuse the Norwegians of a breach of fair trade by flooding the market with 40,000 tonnes of subsidised fish, equivalent to the entire Scottish output for a year.
We're asking our government to stand up for the industry in the Brussels corridors of power and ensure that the European Union makes Norway observe the GATT rules.
One of the larger fish farming companies on the Isle of Skye is owned by musician Ian Anderson of the rock band Jethro Tull. He says Europe must introduce an intervention scheme to regulate the supply of fish onto the market.
we need to achieve these kind of controls quickly. Next year, we're going to see a lot of layoffs in the salmon industry in Scotland, in Norway, in Ireland. It has to happen. There's going to be some real casualties.
But even if action is taken now, it may be too late to save many of the smaller farmers when the full effects of the crisis are felt early next year. Some observers believe that more than 1,000 jobs could be lost, and that would devastate the fragile rural economies in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. Andrew Castle, BBC News, the Isle of Skye.